Active Directory tools. In this nugget, we'll be looking at Active Directory tools. One of the tools that we're going to be looking at is the replication monitoring that's available through the Directory Services Event Viewer in computer management. That's very useful for tracking not only informational messages, but also errors and warnings. Then we'll also take a look at triggering the knowledge consistency checker, which you may need to do manually if you've made a recent change to your network, and you want the KCC to recalculate all of its connection objects. If it's not able to create a connection object automatically, you can also manually create a connection object. And then sometimes you'll need to compare various versions of domain controllers with their versions of the ntds.dit file and see if there's any disparities between them. DSA stat's a great tool for that. And then repadmin is a great tool to control granularly the actual replication that takes place between your domain controllers. Now, replimon is also very powerful, and it does a lot of the same things that repadmin does, but it's a GUI tool, a little bit easier to use. We'll take a look at that as well. And then finally, we'll conclude with restoring Active Directory. What if something goes wrong? Well, you need to do either an authoritative or a non-authoritative restore, and we'll discuss the differences between the two and show you how to do them. You ever had car trouble? I know I sure have, and it can be really frustrating. We just bought a new SUV that my wife used for her design business because she has to have a big vehicle to haul around pieces of furniture and various stuff that she gets for this interior design business. So at least that's the excuse I give myself for burning all that fossil fuel. Anyway, we bought the new car, and we brought it home from the dealership. A couple of days later, the air conditioner stopped working, which in the middle of July, when temperatures 110 and 112, can be quite frustrating. And it's been in the shop 4 times, and it's been in the shop for about 2 weeks, and they still haven't gotten to the bottom of it. So yeah, I'm on my soapbox, and now I'm a little bit frustrated. I guess I shouldn't really name the make of the vehicle, but its initials are DODGE. Anyway, things like that can be a little frustrating. Oh, and to make it worse, not only does the air conditioner stop working, it doesn't just blow out, neutral air from outside. It turns on the heat. I mean, the air conditioner is on full blast, and the dial is clear over to the dark blue section, and we're getting heat out of the vents. Wow, that's really needed in Phoenix, Arizona. Anyway, Active Directory can be equally as frustrating, and it might even make you sweat just as much, especially because you can be under a lot of high-tension issues when you're trying to work with Active Directory and getting the directory replicated properly around your environment. And one of the things you can do to make sure that replication is happening properly, or to identify issues that might be hindering Active Directory replication from occurring properly, is to go to the Computer Management Console by right-clicking my computer and choosing Manage. And once we get into this, we can go to the Event Viewer and then specifically to Directory Service, which tracks events that happen related to Active Directory replication. So let's start by just looking at a couple of these. Let's double-click on this one as a warning. The KCC enabled to complete a spanning tree network topology. You see, the KCC does use a spanning tree algorithm to build connection objects to the destination site. And here's the site it's unable to reach. This message is from the domain controller in Phoenix. Can't reach Tucson because the only domain controller I have down there was turned off at the time that this message was generated. Let's see what else we got here. Next message down, unable to work with the configuration naming context. Again, it couldn't build enough information for the spanning tree algorithm topology to create a replication topology. So again, that's because that domain controller is turned off. Here we actually have some suggestions on what to do. It says we can publish sufficient site connectivity information. How do you do that? It doesn't tell you everything. Some of you kind of have to guess at. So that the KCC can determine a route, or you can manually add a connection object. Let's go ahead and address that. If we were really having a problem with the KCC, but we knew that the WAN connectivity was up and all of our connections were okay, there was no firewall problem, something like that, then we could go directly into Active Directory sites and services, or you can use some command line tools, which I'll also show you a little bit later on here. And you can go into these connection objects and you just right-click. For example, I'm on DC Nugget 1, that's where I was reading the event log. I can just right-click on its NTDS settings, and down here under All Tasks, kind of buried in this, is this thing that says Check Replication Topology. Well, that's a KCC trigger, and what it's going to do is determine or rediscover its Active Directory connection objects. That's going to check out the topology again and click OK here, and you don't really necessarily see anything. It should just do it. Now, if these two objects, for example, had been deleted or somebody had manually fiddled with them and goofed them up, then you could delete these two and do that thing that I just showed you that would automatically rebuild those connection objects. In fact, just let me go ahead and refresh the screen here. Let me go ahead and just do that. I'll go ahead and delete these. And again, this might be if we suspect that the KCC has built these incorrectly for some reason. Maybe our network configuration has changed drastically, or somebody just went in here and fiddled with stuff and just broke it. We can just delete these. That's okay. Don't worry about it. All we have to do is to right-click, choose All Tasks, check Replication Topology, click OK, and refresh the screen here, and we see that it's automatically rebuilt these two connection objects. Now, the other thing you could do is, if you feel that perhaps the connections are wrong with these, for example, this one is going to automatically replicate from DC Nugget 3. And by the way, if I right-click on this and choose Replicate Now, what that's doing is it's going to pull any new directory information, if there's any that exists, from DC Nugget 3. It doesn't push to DC Nugget 3. It pulls from DC Nugget 3. That's important to understand because you need to know which direction the replication is taking place in. So I could replicate now and I'll go ahead and allow the replication to take place. Or if this had a problem, it was replicating to or from the wrong server, or actually from the wrong server, I could go to its properties. And here it says it's replicating from DC Nugget 3. I could say, well, that's not right. It's not supposed to replicate from that one. It's supposed to be replicating from, DC Nugget 2 or something like that. All I have to do is select the other server here and then click OK. I don't really want to do that, so I'll just cancel out of that. But that's another thing you could do if you, as the administrator, were pretty sure that you were smarter than the KCC, which, quite frankly, no offense to your highly evolved brain, but very seldom, if ever, is that going to be true because the KCC does an outstanding job and it has higher function math that most humans can't come up with off the top of their head. But in the rare case that you know something about your network that the KCC can't possibly figure out, perhaps such as you want to go around a bad network connection or an unreliable network connection, maybe they've got construction in the area where the connection keeps blinking on and off or something like that, then you might manually determine that you want to replicate from a different server. By the way, as long as I've made those replications, let's go back to computer management here, and we see that now we have some normal messages, some informational messages about the NTDS KCC, and this is just useful to kind of go through for educational purposes, if nothing else. And what we're seeing here is just replicated from this source, DC Nugget 2, to DC Nugget 1. So on DC Nugget 1, I pulled. Remember, I right-clicked on the connection object that connected to DC Nugget 2, and I chose to replicate now. And we get similar message to DC Nugget 3. What else we got? Here's again DC Nugget 2, DC Nugget 3 again. So that's all that is. It's telling me when it successfully replicated those objects. Now, as I mentioned before, you can manually create a connection object. If you need to do that, you just right-click, choose New Active Directory Connection, and then you just build it on your own. You say, I want to replicate from, DC Nugget 3, click OK. There's already a connection there. If you want to create another connection, I could just say yes. Normally, we wouldn't have to do that since there's already one there. We're just doing this academically. And then we'll just go ahead and name the new connection object. I can just leave it at the name that it gives me there. Click OK. Now I've actually got two connection objects from DC Nugget 3. But this might be useful if the KCC, for some reason, is having trouble building this automatically generated connection to DC Nugget 3, and yet I know that it needs to be able to make that connection. Well, I can at least temporarily build a manual one here, and then when my network connectivity improves, then I can allow the connection to automatically be created again and delete this one. It doesn't hurt a thing. I'll just delete it. And then once again, trigger the KCC to automatically generate this one. Now, sometimes it's useful to be able to identify if an object has been replicated from one domain controller to the other. So if I go to Active Directory Users and Computers, I'm going to create a new user account here on DC Nugget 1, and then we're going to go ahead and use a specific tool to see whether or not it's been replicated to DC Nugget 3. And in this case, I know it won't because I've increased our replication frequency back to 3 hours. And I'm not going to wait 3 hours for it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new user account, and I'll start recording again once I've completed. So here I've created a new user account, Helga Hinkle. I don't know why I have to create all these strange-sounding names. But anyway, there's Helga Hinkle, and we're going to see whether or not she's replicated over to DC Nugget 3. And, of course, we know she hasn't, but we want to confirm that using a command line tool. And it's very useful in troubleshooting to see whether or not another domain controller is receiving an object that you think it should have received by now. Now here I've just gone ahead and typed in the whole command so you don't have to watch me type all of this. And by the way, this is another one of those tools that involves quite a lot of typing. But anyway, I'm comparing servers. That's /S for server, DC Nugget 1 against DC Nugget 3 separated by a semicolon and no space. /B to recognize the base distinguished object, in this case of OU Phoenix. And this is the rest of the distinguished name in the domain. /GC attributes, global catalog attributes. So we're going to look at all of them. I don't probably need to have that. I'm just showing you some other options that are available, as well as these other options that are not necessarily important. But /sort :true will sort according to globally unique identifiers, or GWIDs. Makes it a little bit easier to read when you need to make the comparisons. /T for true, or excuse me, /T for false here will just perform a full content comparison, whereas a /true would have performed a statistical comparison. And the statistical comparison that would perform with true would just count the objects. A /T:false will actually compare every object with attribute values. And then finally, this /P here just limits the number of pages that are going to be put out. By default, it's 64 pages. We're probably going to see 1 or 2 pages, but I'll just put 16 in there anyway. And then I'll press Enter. It does take a few seconds to run. I see already that there's a difference in the number of entries between DC Nugget 1 and DC Nugget 3, which maybe saw it kind of scroll by there really quickly on the screen there. Gives you a lot of pretty deep information if you want to look at it. Kind of a little bit misleading in some places because it says there's a mismatch fail here with certain objects. In reality, however, this object here, for example, Johansson Splinkmeyer, that person's on both domain controllers, and yet it says fail here, so a little bit misleading in the way it reads in certain places. Here again, it counts the number of objects. DC Nugget 1 has 9 objects. DC Nugget 3 doesn't line up the columns quite right, but DC Nugget 3 is 8 objects. And then we can see further on down here at the bottom exactly which object is missing from DC Nugget 3. And if I can read the forest for the tree, there it is. Helga Hinkle is missing on DC Nugget 3. So this tool is really good for comparing directories between 2 domain controllers. Now here I've cleared the screen and typed up another command here, and this would do a similar thing to what we just looked at, except this time I would do a comparison against all objects in the entire domain. Now this could be quite verbose, so you probably want to put this out to something like a text file of some kind, so I might do a command like this at the end, which will put it out to a DSA stat.txt file, just a little greater than symbol there, and then the name of the text file that I want to put it out to. And it's going to go ahead and create this file for me after a few seconds. And so we see that it's gone ahead and run that. And then I'll go ahead and open it up in Notepad, and this is quite a lot of verbose information, but at least it makes it a little bit easier to read than just reading it in the command line. So you'll see all the different kinds of stuff that's included in here, and it's quite detailed, and we won't exhaust this, but it's quite detailed information, might be quite useful for you using this tool. Now another tool that's probably, gosh, I think from the command line, it's probably the most powerful tool that we have at our disposal, is one called repadmin. Now this has quite a lot of various options and parameters that you can specify, which you can see with the /question mark here. There's a whole bunch of different things you can use with this, and the online help system is good in designating or identifying all of the switches you can use. However, let's just get a sampling of a few things we can look for. For example, maybe I want to see who my replication partners are, so I'll just type repadmin. Show REPL DC Nugget 1. I want to see who the replication partners are for DC Nugget 1. Press Enter. Then it tells me for each naming context who my replication partner is. So for the domain naming context, it shows me my replication naming partner is DC Nugget 3 via RPC. And the last time I made an attempt at replication, it was successful on this date and time. And I see similar information for my configuration naming context, which remember, DC Nugget 2 is part of the forest, and it needs part of the configuration naming context. For example, the sites and connection objects themselves are part of the configuration naming context, so it replicated with that one. It tells me the last time it attempted to replicate and was successful as well. So this also just tells me if I'm successfully replicating with those partners. Now, another way of using repadmin is to show the up-to-dateness vector to compare it between 2 different domain controllers. So, for example, here's DC Nugget 1. I'm running it on DC Nugget 1 in this naming context. And for DC Nugget 1 down here, for example, it gives me an update sequence number. Now, what's an update sequence number? This is just a number that Active Directory uses to track the most recent updates to a particular object. And on DC Nugget 1, the update sequence number appears to be 55914. Now I run that against the same command against DC Nugget 3, and it sees the update at 55913, which tells me that DC Nugget 3 has not yet received the latest up-to-dateness vector from DC Nugget 1, meaning that there are changes that it has not yet pulled down. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that could be. And in this case, it's real simple. I just added a middle initial W to this user account, and that's the only thing that it hasn't received yet. Now, it doesn't tell me that specifically in this. It just tells me that there are updates that have not yet been made between the two. And by the way, in case you think that we might ever run out of update sequence numbers, because again, it increments them every time there's been a new object or a change made to an object. It's a 64-bit number that it uses to increment these, and we kind of get accustomed to 64-bit, 128-bit, 256-bit, all that kind of stuff, and we kind of throw around those bits casually. But a 64-bit number means that there's enough numbers so that I could increment 10,000 update sequence numbers per second for 66 million years before I run out of numbers. So that should keep us busy for a while. Now I can also use repadmin with the show con item here with DC Nugget 1 to show the replication partners, the inbound partners here. And by pressing enter, it'll give me the same information that I would get in Active Directory sites and services and more, because it identifies things such as whether or not there have been any recent failures. It shows the last replication cycle if there were any failures. We don't have any here. It shows me the connection name here by GUID. It shows me the DNS name, the fully distinguished name that we see here, and so forth. Also shows me what it's replicating with that naming context, the schema, configuration, and domain naming context in this case. And also shows me any other domain controllers that it's replicating with. So that's very handy for that kind of an item. Now the command we see here is repadmin/replicate, and this is going to replicate a specific domain controller with another domain controller. This is the destination domain controller, dcnugget3. This is the source destination domain controller, dcnugget1. And this is the domain naming context that we've decided to replicate, and you can choose another naming context if you want. By the way, I point out that this is the destination and this is the source because some Microsoft documentation has those exactly backwards. So it starts off with the destination, and this is the source. Let's go ahead and run this, and we'll see that it replicated successfully from dcnugget1 to dcnugget3. And we can confirm that if we go to dcnugget3 here then, and if I refresh the screen and go to this user account, we see that it has now taken the middle initial that I had put in there earlier. Now what I've got in the command here for repadmin is pretty much the shotgun blast of all replication. It's going to synchronize with all of its replication partners. It's going to be a /A here. That's a capital A, case sensitive. And that simply means that it's going to replicate all the naming contexts. /lowercase e is going to replicate across site boundaries, so it's not going to be just intra-site replication, but also inter-site replication. And then /P means it's going to push the replication changes out from dcnugget1 to its replication partners, and that's opposite of the default behavior where it sends notifications out and then has a pull action. So I'm going to do all of this, and what I'm going to do here, first of all, is I'm going to go to this user account. I'm going to, let's say, just remove the W here now. We'll blank that out. So now it's got a blank for that middle initial. On dcnugget3, we see that it still has the middle initial there. So now what we're going to do is to go ahead and run this command, press enter here, and we see that it's synchronizing with all those naming contexts. For example, if I go back up here to the top, it's replicating DNS information, forest DNS zones, domain DNS zones. Those are two naming contexts that are custom and new with Windows Server 2003. There's the schema naming context, configuration naming context, and domain naming context. Seems to have done it with no errors. Now when I go back to dcnugget3 and double click on it, we see that it has indeed removed that middle initial, so we see that we confirm that it did work properly. Now another pretty handy tool that I think you're going to like is going to be RepelMon, and one reason why you might like it is because not only is it a GUI interface, as you can see here, but it's also pretty powerful. And in order to work with this, you simply add monitored servers, and I'm going to add them explicitly by name, or I could search the directory for them. I'm just going to manually enter in dcnugget1, and there's dcnugget1 now with all of its naming contexts, including a couple of DNS domain naming contexts, or a couple of DNS naming contexts. I could add another server here if I want to monitor a couple of them at a time. Just going to add dcnugget3 this time. And now we've got that domain controller up here as well. Now this is very useful for comparing objects back and forth between domain controllers. So for example, in my domain naming context here, I see that it's got dcnugget3 and dcnugget1 that share the same naming context. What I could do with this then is, if I want to, is I could synchronize this directory partition with all servers. That might be useful because I might have changes that I want to push out. Again, with this radio button here, this checkbox, I can use push mode instead of using pull. I can cross site boundaries, which is going to be important between these two domain controllers because they are separated by a site. So I can click OK and then replicate all of that. Just tells me that it could take a while if I've got a lot of replication to take place. And then it tells me that it has triggered the replication successfully. Now also notice that that was just for that specific naming context of nuggetlab.com, the domain naming context. I could do that for the rest of these, or I could go up here to the domain at the top, or rather to the domain controller, and I could synchronize each directory partition with all servers. I get a similar dialog box here. Again, I could just synchronize everything. In this case, again, yes through everything, and we get a full replication. Now, if I've been making changes to my domain controllers, I've moved them around, maybe I've put them in different locations, I can right-click on the domain controller here and choose to check the replication topology, which will trigger the KCC. That's very useful if I need to rebuild or renew connection objects. Other things that I can choose from the right-click, and again, this utility is pretty right-click happy. Most everything you're going to do is from a right-click menu or from this action menu up here, which reflects the same commands. Other things I can do then would be to show domain controllers in a domain. Might be handy if I'm in a large environment, and I'm not even really sure where all my domain controllers are for this domain. It just shows them to me right there. Other things I could do also would be to right-click and choose to show the replication topologies. That shows me that dcnugget1 replicates directly with dcnugget2. I can right-click and choose Show Intra-Site Connections, and that's actually what it shows me by default. And then to show inter-site connections, it'll actually tell me to go to the properties of this connection, and that's what it shows me right there. It tells me to go to the properties right here, and then to go to the inbound replication connections, and it shows me all of the other replication connections here. And then it simply specifies by GUID. Of course, there's the connection name, then there's the server name here. It's automatically generated, and it gives you some more advanced details about it down here as well, including what directory partitions are replicated out. Other things I like about this, by the way, is that it'll also show you certain server flags, such as what kind of a server it is. In this case, it shows me some of the FSMA roles. This is the PDC for the domain, for example. And it's the global catalog server. It's a KDC is running on this. Basically, all domain controllers have the KDC service. It's running the W32 time service to synchronize the remainder of my domain with the proper times. And rights to the Active Directory are allowed on this server, which again is going to always be true of an Active Directory domain controller. Then here's all the FSMA roles. It identifies all of these being on DC Nugget 1. I can check that out and query against it to make sure that it is working properly here. And it tells me that it was able to resolve, connect, and bind to that specific FSMA role. So again, with RepLMon, we get pretty much a wealth of information about our servers and about Active Directory. Other things we can do with this is to check group policy object status. You see, group policy objects really built in Active Directory, but they're also dependent upon certain files and templates that appear within the sysvol. So we can right-click here and choose to show group policy object status, and it shows us that we have a couple of policies here and the version number for those group policy objects. And the key thing here is to make sure that the version that we see here matches the version that we see here, because that would be the version in Active Directory, and that's the version that will appear in the sysvol, so that helps to make sure that they're all synchronized properly. We can also look at some other information, such as the global catalog servers. If we're not sure who our global catalog servers are, it tells us right there as well. Also, I can identify a number of other different roles, such as the global catalog servers, which it'll list them for me right there. I can also identify bridgehead servers, so I can see which bridgehead servers are in this server site or the entire enterprise, and it identifies both of them for me here as well. And then also I can go back down here and look at trust relationships. Now I have a trust relationship with another domain called CBT Nuggets, and it's part of the same forest, therefore that's why it appears here, and it shows us that it is a two-way trust relationship. Now I can also look at attribute metadata, so I can just select my credentials that I've already supplied because there are administrator credentials in the domain. And then I can enter in an account here like I've done, just enter in the distinguished name, and it shows me all of the attributes for this specific account. Now you can't change any of that information, and that's not the objective of this particular interface. What it does show me though is the update sequence number on the local server and the update sequence number on the originating server, which happens to also be the local server here. And the reason why these update sequence numbers and the originating server is important is because we don't want to replicate a change, say, to the logon hours from DC Nugget 1 to DC Nugget 3. And then at our next pull from DC Nugget 3 to DC Nugget 1, we don't want to pull the exact same information that we just sent to DC Nugget 3 because that would be unnecessarily redundant. So by looking at the local update sequence number and comparing it to the update sequence number on the originating server, we can prevent that kind of thing from happening, and that's what's called propagation dampening. Oh, let me point out this too, but the version number over here, normally that's going to be a lower number, 1, 2, 3, something like that. Why is this 200,000 for many of these attributes? That's because I've performed 2 authoritative restores to Active Directory on this domain controller. Each time I've done that, it's incremented the numbers by 100,000. There's a good reason for that we'll talk about when we talk about Active Directory recovery, but in short, it prevents another domain controller from overriding an Active Directory restore when we don't want that to happen. Picture this. You're just getting ready to turn in for the night. You stayed up a little too late, you're really tired, and the phone rings. Turns out to be the Director of Human Resources, and she says, hey, I need you to do whatever you do to connect to those servers, VPN, I think you call it, and VPN to your servers and manage a couple of user accounts. We got some big news coming in the morning, and I want it to be all ready by the time you get to work tomorrow. You say, oh, all right, fine. So you say, you need to do user management, okay, so she waits while you VPN in, and you connect to Active Directory users and computers. And you say, okay, I'm there, what do you want me to do? And she says, all right, first thing, this user named Todd Logan, this is a horrible user. He's not any good. He's lazy. He never does any work. We want you to get rid of him, just delete his account. We're not even going to replace him. You say, oh, boy, okay, really? You sure you want me to delete this account, Todd Logan? She says, yes. All right. And do you mind my asking, what did he do that was so bad? She says, well, Friday was Hawaiian shirt day, and he did not wear a Hawaiian shirt. We don't think he's a team player at all. Oh, okay, that's a pretty bad transgression. I'll just right-click on his account and delete Todd Logan. Okay, deleted Todd Logan. And now you're suddenly wide awake and alert because you just realized that on Friday you didn't wear a Hawaiian shirt either. Well, anyway, the next thing she says is, okay, great, so you deleted the Todd Logan account. Glad to get rid of him. The next thing I have to tell you is there's another user named Logan Todd. Now, that person has just been promoted to Chief Executive Officer. We want you to add that to their description and join them to the Executive Security Group so they can access all the confidential documents that they need to access. So you say, okay, Logan Todd, and we go to make them person a CEO, and we're going to make them a member of the Executive Security Group. So, okay, man, this person's probably going to get a $100,000 raise, man, a nice Mercedes, company perks, all that kind of stuff. Looks great. And she says, okay, now let's just review here. What you did was you deleted Todd Logan, right? And you made Logan Todd the Chief Executive Officer, added him to the Executive Security Group, right? And you look at this and you think, okay, last name first, first name last. Yeah, that's exactly what I did. That's exactly what I did. Don't worry about it. Everything's all taken care of for tomorrow. And it's at this point that you realize you got the name Todd Logan and Logan Todd mixed up, and you deleted the wrong account, and you promoted the wrong user. Now this user that they hate has been promoted to a Chief Executive Officer, at least in his account here, and he's a member of the Executive Security Group. When you combine that little mistake with the fact that you didn't wear a Hawaiian shirt on Friday, now you know you're in serious jeopardy. What are you going to do? You see, the problem is, especially in Windows Server 2003, remember how fast things start to replicate around? Well, this domain controller is going to replicate to its next replication partner like 15 seconds. So there's no way for you to kind of stop this from going around to the other domain controllers and marking them all as deleted objects and putting them in the deleted objects container, which is how objects are actually deleted. It's not a container you can see. It's invisible to the naked eye, so to speak. It's not available in the interface. But there is a container called deleted objects where now our user account called Logan Todd has been put. There's no way to get them back out. It's not like the recycle bin that you have on the desktop there where you can recover old documents. And there is a third-party product from, I think it's from Autoprof, that will allow you to recover deleted objects. But other than that, you're done for, man, because you've messed up these user accounts. So what are you going to do? Well, that's where a backup of Active Directory comes in handy. You see, you've already made a backup, and provided you've already made a backup at some point in the recent past, that has to be less than 60 days because you want to avoid what's called a tombstone interval. Anyway, as long as you've made a backup of the system state within the recent past, then you can reboot this server into something called Directory Services Restore mode, and that's what I'm going to do here. And once you reboot into Directory Services Restore mode, you can then recover that system state and recover those user accounts. Now, the key thing there is that you're going to have to recover them using what's called an authoritative restore as opposed to a non-authoritative restore. An authoritative restore will recover the objects regardless of whether or not they've been deleted. And while I'm waiting for this server to restart, let me explain that more completely. See, the key here is you got to remember that these user accounts all have version numbers. Remember we saw that in Rempelmon a little while ago. Well, on this domain controller, if I delete my user account right here out of this Phoenix OU, it doesn't actually delete the account. Because if it did delete the account and totally eradicated it, then how would it replicate to domain controller 2 that it's now deleted that account? It has nothing to send over there. It's just a nothing. So how do we tell that domain controller to delete this account? Well, the way that's done is that user account is not actually deleted. They're actually moved into something called the deleted objects container. And so now that's where this user account is. All of their attributes are stripped, such as, a lot of the information about that account, its group memberships, all that kind of stuff. All the attributes are stripped out. And all that's left is more or less a husk of that user account, or a skeleton. And then, now since we've moved it out of there and it no longer exists in the original organizational unit, we do have something to communicate to domain controller 2. And this domain controller will say, hey, move this account into deleted objects, and it will know to strip out all the attributes. So when the next replication cycle happens, it says, oh, okay, I get it. I'm going to go ahead and move that person into the deleted objects container. And there we go. Voila. Got rid of that. Okay, we're good. Now, you see, the other thing to keep in mind here is, let's say that when we originally created this user account, they had a version number of 1. Now we've moved them into deleted objects. Now the version number is 2. Again, over here, that's going to be replicated as well, 1 and 2. Now, what happens is, if I just do a non-authoritative restore, which I'm about to show you how to do an authoritative and a non-authoritative restore, but I will restore Active Directory from backup. And moreover, I can restore just certain parts of Active Directory from backup. authoritatively if I want to. Now, in a non-authoritative restore, what would happen is it would recreate this user account. It doesn't really recreate it. It just takes it off a tape or whatever and restores that user account to its original condition and its original version number. Now, when this domain controller reboots, it's going to check with DC number 2, and it's going to say, hey, I've got version number 1 for this user account at Phoenix. And DC2 says, well, then you're wrong, because that user account was deleted, and I've got a more authoritative version number incremented at version number 2. Therefore, I'm right. And then this domain controller says, oh, okay, I guess I'm supposed to delete them and put them in deleted objects. And then you're right back where you started from. Well, you see, an authoritative restore will do this. Yes, it will take this user account, place them back into their organizational unit, but then instead of just leaving the version number at 1, it increments it by 100,000. Did I make that right? 100,000. So now it'd be 100,001. Well, I guess I better write it down right. 100,001, because we started off with a property version of 1, right? And that's actually 100,000 per day. So if the backup that I'm using to restore this account is 3 days old, then it would actually be 300,001. Well, now that we've done that, when we restore this user account, and we don't have them in the deleted objects anymore, and we have now a much more authoritative version number at 100,001. So when we replicate after rebooting, then it will tell this domain controller, says, hey, you've got that user account in deleted objects. That's not right, because I got 100,000. Put that user account over here with 100,001 as the version number. So what I need to do is to recover that data from Active Directory from a system state backup. And the only way to do that is to reboot this server into Directory Services Restore mode. Now, to get to Directory Services Restore mode, as soon as the computer restarts and as soon as it gets past the BIOS and the post check and all that kind of stuff, you want to hit the F8 key repeatedly. And I say repeatedly because it used to be in Windows 2000, there would be a brief message at the bottom that said press F8 to get to that menu. But now in Windows Server 2003, they've taken that away, so it's kind of difficult to identify in the boot process exactly where that's going to be. So you kind of got to keep hitting F8 after it gets past post. And then it'll give you a menu option that asks you to choose among various options, such as a normal startup or a safe mode, or one of the options is Directory Services Restore mode, which is what I selected. And now when I go ahead and log on to this server, we'll see that you'll have to log on with the credentials of the administrator account because Active Directory has not loaded because we're in Directory Services Restore mode. Therefore, I cannot use my normal user account, my domain admin's user account. So we'll just log on as a local administrator here, and if there was a problem previously, it asked me to log why the system shut down unexpectedly, and we'll just click OK past that for the time being because it's not relevant. Now, Directory Services Restore mode is a version of safe mode as well, so we'll just click OK past that message because that's all it's telling us is that we are booting in a version of safe mode. And by the way, one other thing about pressing F8, let me come back to that. When you're pressing F8, if it starts to go to the splash screen where it says, Windows Server 2003, and the little animated multicolored flag comes up, you've gone too far and you've missed the opportunity to get to the menu, so you'll have to restart after that. Now let's go back to all programs, accessories, system tools, and the backup utility here. And this is where we're going to be able to do a non-authoritative restore and an authoritative restore. Now, let me point out that you always start with a non-authoritative restore, and then you can add to that the fact that you want it to be an authoritative restore. There's a wizard you can go through for all this. I'm going to go to advanced mode to manually choose the restoration process. Here's my system state backup, which I just put on a local drive. So I'm going to restore the system state to its original location, click Start Restore, and it's going to override everything. We'll click OK for everything here, and that's pretty much it. I'm going to let it do its thing, and I'll be back with you when it's finished. And I'm kind of allowing it to do its thing here, but let me point out also while it's doing this, why would you want to do a non-authoritative restore? Well, you could do that if you have some corruption in Active Directory or in the ntds.dit file. There are tables in the ntds.dit, and if there's a row or a column corrupt or there's something that's misaligned in that somehow, you could just do a non-authoritative restore and then reboot the computer. And provided the original backup that you're using here is a healthy backup, then it should reconstruct Active Directory and give you a good working copy again. And once this is done, it gives us a summary at the end here. We'll go ahead and close this out. It asks if we want to restart the computer. The reflex is just click on yes. In fact, I almost just did that just this very moment. Click no. you really should click no if you want to do an authoritative restore. Why? Because if you click yes and it starts to restart, you're going to have to get back into Active Directory restore mode, Directory Services restore mode, because you need to perform an authoritative restore. You don't want it to reboot, because then you'll just have to start all over again, because then the replication will start to take place again, and you'll wind up right back where you were. So we'll stay within this interface and then go to a command prompt to do our authoritative restore. So from within this, we're going to go ahead and run ntdsutil, and from within this, we're going to go ahead and run an authoritative restore. And you can just type the first few characters and make it distinct enough to have it figure out which command prompt you want. We're at the authoritative restore prompt right now. And then what we want to do here is I can show you the various items you can run. You can restore the entire database. That's highly questionable, though, because if your database is, say, 600 megabytes and it's doing an authoritative restore, then every object throughout the entire database is going to get replicated to all other domain controllers. And if you got 100 domain controllers throughout the globe over all kinds of links, you're going to trigger massive and potentially crippling replication. So be very careful about that, only for dire emergencies. And that's one of those, break glass in case of emergency kind of an operations you'd want to do. In our particular case, we could restore a specific object, so I could restore, the one user account I deleted, or I could restore an entire subtree if I want. That's going to be a little bit easier for me right now. We can do it either way, whichever way works for you. In our case, we can cover the whole thing in a specific object, so I'm just going to recover, how about that organizational unit of Phoenix. And like a politician, I backtracked, and I said I'm going to just restore the object anyway. I'm just going to restore the object for Logan Todd, which is the account that we deleted that we actually want back. So to do that, I'm going to restore object, and then I entered this in quotation marks, and the reason why I did that is because the common name of Logan Todd has a space in it, so we need the quotation marks there. So now let's go ahead and run that. It says, are you sure you want to perform this authoritative restore? And it brought this prompt up when I pressed the enter key. You couldn't really see me do that, so I thought I'd better explain it. Then it opens the ntds.dit database file, and now it's going to increment that file for that particular user object. And we see that it successfully updated that specific user object, and we're done with this authoritative restore for that one user account. And in fact, we see here that it did increment it by 100,000. So now we can just quit all of this and exit out of that, and then all we have to do is to restart this server, and we'll just restart it normally, and you can enter in a comment with this if you want to as well. Restored Logan Todd user account, and click OK. And then it's just going to restart, and when it comes back up, that account will be incremented by 100,000. So now here I've come back into Active Directory users and computers on the domain controller. There's my Logan Todd account that I have now restored. I can give it the appropriate description now. This is the good user that we want to keep. We want to add them again to the executives security group so that they can access all of that confidential data they need to access. Here's the no good user that we wanted to delete. So I'll select that user, delete that object, and the universe is good again. The planets are all lined up, and hopefully we can keep our job as long as we wear our Hawaiian shirts on Fridays. And then also here I've gone back to the replication monitor, and I'm connecting to the common name of Logan Todd, PhoenixNuggetsLab.com. Click OK, and we see that indeed it has incremented that specific user's account by 100,000. So that's the proof of the fact that we did an authoritative restore on that account. In this nugget, we discussed various Active Directory tools, such as how to look at the monitoring of Active Directory. So we can look at the event viewer in Directory Services, for example, and we saw that there were various error messages and warnings, many of which actually even tell you how to fix the problem. So that's very handy and pretty well done by Microsoft, I should say. We can also look at the ability to trigger replication for our connection objects so that it can either rebuild connection objects or confirm the connection objects it has. And we saw that if it doesn't build a connection object that you want, you can even temporarily build a manual connection object until you get the replication that you want and until maybe the KCC is woken up to unavailable connection. We also took a look at various command line tools such as DSA stat, which is an excellent way to compare different versions of Active Directory between domain controllers. Rep admin, which is a great way to control replication between your domain controllers. And then replimon, which is also a great way to control that replication, but it's a GUI tool as opposed to a command line tool here. And then we saw how to restore Active Directory. We saw that we can do that either non-authoritatively, which is what you always have when you restore from a backup, system state backup in Directory Services restore mode, and then you make it an authoritative restore by going to ntdsutil and typing authoritative restore and restoring whichever objects are necessary. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.